Hi, my name is ProFed. This channel is designed to act as a springboard of life inequalities. Join me on this journey, dear beloved one.
Aristotle said, the worst form of inequality is to try to make unequal things equal. Thurgood Marshall said, where you see wrong or inequality or injustice, speak out, because this is your country. This is your democracy. Make it. Protect it. Pass it on. Annalee Newitt said, capitalism is, fundamentally, an economic system that promotes inequality. Nicholas Kristof said, inequality causes problems by creating fissures in societies, leaving those at the bottom feeling marginalized or disenfranchised. Nelson Mandela said, as long as poverty, injustice and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. B.R. Ambedkar said, what are we having this liberty for? We are having this liberty in order to reform our social system, which is full of inequality, discrimination and other things, which conflict with our fundamental rights. Pope Francis said, human rights are not only violated by terrorism, repression or assassination, but also by unfair economic structures that creates huge inequalities. Said Musa, too often, customary practices and discrimination on the basis of gender, ethnicity, race, religion, social status, or class are the root sources of pervasive inequality in many countries. John F. Kennedy said, there is always inequality in life. Some men are killed in a war and some men are wounded and some men never leave the country. Life is unfair. Marina Hertz said, we live increasingly in a world of haves and have-nots, of gated communities next to ghettos, of extreme poverty and unbelievable riches. Some enjoy rights that are completely denied to others. Relative inequalities are exploding, and the world's poorest, despite all the advances of globalization, may even be getting poorer. Felix Frankfurter also said, it is a wise man who said that there is no greater inequality than the equal treatment of unequals. Life inequality is brought about by the disparity of opportunities which, if present, improve a person's life quality. Finally, income and wealth inequality is how unevenly income is distributed throughout a population. The less equal the distribution, the higher income inequality is. Income inequality is often accompanied by wealth inequality, which is the uneven distribution of wealth. 20 facts about U.S. inequality that you should know. 1. Wage inequality. Over the last 30 years, wage inequality in the United States has increased substantially, with the overall level of inequality now approaching the extreme level that prevailed prior to the Great Depression. This general characterization of the inequality trend oversimplifies, though, the actual pattern of change. The chart below shows that the trend at the top of the income distribution, the upper tail, is not exactly the same as the trend at the bottom of the distribution, the lower tail. Lower tail inequality is measured here by taking the ratio of wages at the middle of the income distribution, that is, the 50th percentile, to those near the bottom of the distribution, that is, the 10th percentile. Upper tail inequality is measured by taking the ratio of wages near the top of the distribution, that is, the 90th percentile, to those at the middle of the distribution, that is, the 50th percentile of workers. We find that lower tail inequality rose sharply in the 1980s and contracted somewhat thereafter, while upper tail inequality has increased steadily since 1980. 2. Homelessness. There are 750,000 Americans who are homeless on any given night, with 1 in 5 of them considered chronically homeless. The ranks of the sheltered homeless include disproportionate numbers of males, blacks, middle-aged people, that is, ages 31-50, veterans, and disabled. 3. Gender pay gaps. Throughout much of the 20th century, the average woman earned about 60% of what the average man earned. Starting in the late 1970s, there was a substantial increase in women's relative earnings, with women coming to earn about 80% of what men earned. This historic rise plateaued in 2005 and, since then, the pay gap has remained roughly unchanged. 4. Education wage premium. Only college graduates have experienced growth in median weekly earnings since 1979, in real terms. High school dropouts have, by contrast, seen their real median weekly earnings decline by about 22%. 5. CEO pay. Recent decades have seen a clear increase in the difference between CEO compensation and that of the average worker in manufacturing or production. CEOs in 1965 made 24 times more than the average production worker, whereas in 2009 they made 185 times more. This chart shows how this ratio between the compensation of CEOs and production workers took off in the 1980s. 6. Occupational sex segregation. Women and men tend to work in very different occupations. And overall men's jobs are better paid than women's jobs. Gendered occupations and unequal rewards. 7. Child poverty. In the United States, 21% of all children are in poverty, a poverty rate higher than what prevails in virtually all other rich nations. 8. Racial gaps in education. High school dropout rates are least among whites and highest among Hispanics, while college enrollment rates are least among blacks and highest among whites. The high school dropout rate has grown more similar among these three groups, while the college enrollment rate has grown more sharply different. 9. Racial discrimination. Racial discrimination continues to be in the labor market. An experiment carried out in Chicago and Boston during 2001 and 2002 shows that resumes with white-sounding names, whether male or female, were much more likely to result in callbacks for interviews than were those with black-sounding names, even though the resumes were otherwise identical. 10. Health insurance. In 2007, 8.1 million children under 18 years old were without health insurance. Children in poverty and Hispanic children were more likely to be uninsured. 11. Residential segregation. We all know that the rich in the United States tend not to live in the same neighborhoods as the poor. But did you know that such residential segregation is on the rise? The graph below reveals that, between 1970 and 2000, there has been a sizable increase in segregation. We show this result by measuring how likely it is for households in the top fifth of the income distribution to live with households not in the top fifth, in 1970 and 2000, and b. how likely it is for households in the bottom fifth of the income distribution to live with households not in the bottom fifth, again in 1970 and 2000. 12. Bad jobs. Bad jobs are typically considered those that pay low wages and do not include access to health insurance and pension benefits. As shown here, about 10% of full-time workers are in low-wage jobs, about 30% don't have health insurance, and about 40% don't have pensions. The graph also shows that the likelihood of being in a bad job is much worse for part-time workers, for on-call and day laborers, and for those working for temporary help agencies. 13. Intragenerational income mobility. Intragenerational income mobility refers to the rate at which a person moves to a higher or lower income level during her or his work career. More than half of those individuals in the bottom income quintile in 1994 remain there 10 years later, and less than 4% reach the top quintile. 14. Wealth inequality. The ownership of wealth among households in the U.S. became somewhat more concentrated since the 1980s. The top 10% of households controlled 68.2% of the total wealth in 1983 and 73.1% of the total wealth in 2007. 15. Discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are persons not currently looking for work because they believe that there are no jobs available for them. The number of discouraged workers in the U.S. increased sharply during the current recession, rising to 717,000 in the first quarter of 2009, a 70% increase from the first quarter of 2008. Relative to their share of the labor force, young people, blacks, and, to a lesser extent, Hispanics and men were overrepresented among discouraged workers. 16. Deregulation of the labor market. The percentage of all wage and salary workers who are union members has declined from 24% in 1973 to 12.4% in 2008. The decline in the private sector was steeper than the decline in the public sector. At the same time as union membership declined, the real value of the minimum wage also fell by 25% in the 1980s, leading to a weakening influence of the minimum wage on the low-wage labor market. These two developments in combination may be understood as the foundation of the newly deregulated U.S. labor market. 17. Intergenerational income mobility. Intergenerational income mobility can be measured by calculating the rate at which individuals move to income quintiles that are different than that of their families of origin. The proportion of sons who remained in the bottom quartile declined between 1961 and 1972 and stayed the same afterward. 18. Job losses. Employment fell by 3.1 million jobs during 2008, and by another 4.7 million jobs in 2009. The job losses in the 2007 to 2009 recession are more severe than in all prior recessions. 19. Incarceration. The incarceration rate in the United States has grown so dramatically since the 1970s that the U.S. now has one of the highest rates in the world. The rise in incarceration has been especially prominent among young black males and high school dropouts. As it was told, a full 37% of those who are both young black males and high school dropouts are now in prison or jail, a rate that's more than 3 times higher than what prevailed in 1980. 20. Immigrants and inequality. Does immigration to the U.S. bring highly skilled workers into the labor force or unskilled workers? The answer is both. The education distribution below indicates that immigrants are concentrated in both tails of the skill distribution.
According to former Apple software engineer David Scher, the tech company worked with the U.S. Department of Energy on a covert project back in 2005. The special iPod was allegedly supposed to act as a Geiger counter by testing radiation levels in the air, he shared in tidbits. You could walk around a city, casually listening to your tunes, while recording evidence of radioactivity, scanning for smuggled or stolen uranium, for instance, or evidence of a dirty bomb development program, with no chance that the press or public would get wind of what was happening. Did you know the FBI is tracking Bigfoot? Apparently, the FBI really does have a file on everyone, including mystical creatures like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Deep within the FBI's Freedom of Information library, you can track down the agency's file on Bigfoot. Files are released only when a subject is deceased, which not only points to the figure being real, but also suggests that the agency believes it is dead.
Climate change hits the poorest the hardest. Extreme weather patterns attributed to climate change are widening inequality. Low-income groups tend to be more exposed to environmental threats, like flooding, hurricanes, and heat waves, and live in communities without effective disaster relief strategies. How do we fix economic inequality? An overview of policies for United Nations and other high-income economies. Section 1. For decades, a gap has been growing between the rich and poor in advanced economies, especially the United States. Then the coronavirus pandemic struck, costing over 1 million lives globally by the end of October 2020 and setting off the worst global recession in nearly a century. The people most vulnerable to a health and economic shock have been hit the hardest. Now, at a time of acute health and economic crisis, widening divisions are raising moral, social, economic, and political challenges. Many experts argue that long-standing U.S. policies that widen inequality have also exacerbated the pandemic's impact. As the United States and other countries strive to rebuild their economies, governments have an opening to alleviate unfair economic disparities and improve access to opportunities. Section 2. Income inequality has grown within advanced economies as top earners have experienced more rapid income growth and bottom earners were left behind. In the past few decades, the Gini coefficient, a standard measure of income distribution across population segments, increased within most high-income economies. The United Nations remains the most unequal high-income economy in the world. The disparity reflects a surge in incomes for the richest population segments, along with sluggish or even falling incomes for the poorest, especially during bad economic times. At the same time, the middle class is shrinking. The percent of Americans in the middle class has dropped since the 1970s, from 61% in 1971 to 51% in 2019. Some have moved up the income ladder, but an increasing number are also moving down. The middle class has also shrunk considerably in countries like Germany, Canada, and Sweden, but other advanced economies have generally experienced more modest declines. Wealth is even more concentrated at the top than income. Wealth buttresses financial security for families. It comprises the value of assets, such as a home or corporate stocks, minus outstanding debt, such as a mortgage or student loans. Wealth is much more concentrated among the top tier of wealth holders, with households in the top 10% of the wealth distribution in high-income countries owning more than half of all household wealth in 2015 or latest year available, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. In the United States, they own 79%. By comparison, the top 10% of all income earners receive about a quarter of all cash income. Changes in wealth inequality in recent years differ across countries, though it grew particularly wider in the US and the United Kingdom after the global financial crisis. The richest Americans have been able to save more of their money and grow their wealth faster than the average American since the late 1980s. A Pew Research Center study finds only upper-income families in the United States grew wealth between 2001 and 2016, gaining 33% at the median. Middle-income families experienced a 20% loss in median net worth, while lower-income families lost 45%. Section 3. The American dream is fading. Generations today are much less likely to earn more than their parents. Social mobility, the chance to move up the income ladder, has fallen in the United Nations. Americans are increasingly stuck in the income bracket they were born into. Research shows on average, almost 80% of children born in 1950 were earning more than their parents by age 30. For children born in 1980, that number dropped to 50%. Escaping poverty has become more difficult as wider economic gains disproportionately benefit wealthier classes. A child born in Canada has almost double the chance of moving from the bottom to top income quintile. The income gap between black and white Americans has remained about the same since the 1980s. The racial wealth gap has widened considerably. White Americans earned 2.5 times more than black Americans in the 1960s. By the 1980s, that differential dropped to 1.3 times more, partially because the minimum wage expanded to more sectors. The racial earnings gap has since stagnated. The U.S. racial wealth gap has grown since the 1980s negative 1990s, and the difference between groups is pronounced. In 2019, a typical white family had 8 times the wealth of a black family and 5 times the wealth of a Hispanic family. Section 4. Technology and trade are factors, but policies determine outcome. Automation and trade liberalization have profoundly transformed labor markets across advanced economies, giving disproportionate advantages to highly skilled and educated workers, and research tells these forces have played a role in widening inequality. But it is important to emphasize the role of governments in mitigating these effects. The United States and Europe have very different levels of inequality despite similar levels of technological change and trade liberalization. Divergent policies among countries must logically have influenced their disparities in the growth and inequality. How have technology and globalization widened inequality within the United States? Economists generally think globalization has contributed marginally to rising U.S. wage inequality, but that technology has played a much bigger role. For the last half-century, the United States has generated tremendous economic growth and wealth as a result of technological innovations and international trade and investment. Tech giants emerged with the advent of the Internet. Businesses tapped global supply chains, technology breakthroughs, and international markets to expand their reach, turning some into multinational powerhouses, generating high-end jobs, and making a whole new range of products affordable for consumers. But some workers have lost out. U.S. industrial production is still at historically high levels, but automation makes that achievement possible with far fewer workers. The U.S. economy, like many advanced economies, has been driven more by services, information, business and professional services, healthcare, restaurants, travel, financial services, and less by manufacturing, with consumers spending a smaller percent of their incomes on manufactured goods than they used to. Technology has reduced demand for certain low and middle wage workers, such as in factory assembly lines, and increased demand for high-skilled, higher-paid workers. To cut costs and stay competitive, many businesses outsourced manufacturing production from domestic factories to countries like China, Vietnam, and Mexico, displacing some domestic manufacturing jobs. A study tells about 156,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost on net each year between 2001 and 2020 from expanded trade, or less than 3% of the workers laid off in a typical year. Men and workers without a college degree have been hardest hit, especially in factory towns outside major U.S. cities. Many of these workers have dropped out of the labor force. By contrast, highly educated and skilled workers, particularly in urban areas, earn a premium. Did you know governments have cut top tax rates? Tax policy is one of the most important factors in determining inequality levels in advanced economies. Taxes in the United States and many other rich countries have become less progressive in the past 50 years, meaning that tax obligations have declined for those with the highest incomes. The top earners used to pay much higher tax rates on their income than they do now. Less progressive taxation has accelerated the growth of top incomes. Section 5. Poor Americans are much less likely to attain higher education than rich Americans. In the United States, 90% of children with parents in the top 10% of the income distribution will likely attend college. For children with parents in the poorest 10%, less than a third will. American families are more burdened by college tuition costs than families in Europe, where higher education is more likely to be free or subsidized. U.S. college tuition for four-year institutions has risen fivefold since 1985, adjusted for inflation, reaching $27,000 a year on average in 2017. U.S. children today are less likely to exceed their parents' standard of living because education levels are failing to grow at the rate required to meet the demand for a more educated workforce. Healthcare in the United States is not universal. The United States is the only wealthy nation without universal health coverage. Healthcare expenditures grew from 5% of GDP in 1960 to almost 18% in 2018. Americans spend more than double on healthcare per person than other wealthy countries on average, many of which have some form of publicly funded healthcare system. Yet the country lags on many health outcomes such as life expectancy and infant mortality. In 2018, 8.5% of people, or 27.5 million, did not have health insurance at all, though the Affordable Care Act made some headway in reducing the number after 2010. Employers that provide health benefits to workers shoulder the costs of rapidly rising insurance premiums. Labor policies. Improving access to quality higher education. Making quality public higher education more accessible to more people is one important way to boost incomes. Many policies have been put forward to address this: tax credits to offset college costs, expanding grants and providing reduced or free tuition for low-income students, that is, Pell Grants, a national service program to allow students to earn money that can be put toward education, canceling outstanding loans based on income, time passed, or amount repaid, providing grants to colleges and universities to give more scholarships, or even canceling tuition entirely. The debate continues over which schools any of these policies should apply to: community colleges and other two-year degree programs, all public colleges, all 2- and 4-year, private schools, etc. Implement talent discovery and matching programs. Identifying talent in low-income areas and giving them access to educational and training opportunities would improve social mobility. Talent matching programs could link people with a specific set of skills with jobs they can pursue in the long term. Give employees more bargaining power at companies. Richard Freeman, Harvard University, calls trade unions the one institutional force that fights against inequality. Several experts point out that as U.S. union membership has fallen, worker bargaining power has declined. As a result, growth in labor productivity has benefited mainly top wage earners. Easing restrictions on the formation of unions would help. Darren Ajemolu, MIT, says corporations should have non-executive workers serve on their boards, the way some German companies do. How does inequality affect your life? Inequalities of opportunity affect a person's life expectancy and access to basic services such as healthcare, education, water, and sanitation. They can curtail a person's human rights through discrimination, abuse, and lack of access to justice. In 2018, we saw the world's 12th consecutive year of decline in global freedom, with 71 countries suffering net declines in political and civil liberties. High levels of inequality of opportunity discourage skills accumulation, choke economic and social mobility, and human development and, consequently, depress economic growth. It also entrenches uncertainty, vulnerability, and insecurity, undermines trust in institutions and government, increases social discord and tensions, and trigger violence and conflicts. There are growing evidence that higher level of income and wealth inequality is propelling the rise of nativism and extreme forms of nationalism. In addition, the evolution of issues such as climate change, technology, and urbanization raise urgent policy challenges. For example, climate change is exacerbating environmental degradation, increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, and by no means impacting people uniformly. If climate change continues unaddressed, it will increase inequality within countries and may even reverse current progress in reducing inequality between countries. Meanwhile, technology can be a great equalizer by enhancing connectivity, financial inclusion, access to trade and public services, for instance, but those yet to be connected may experience further marginalization as a result, especially as progress is slowing, even reversing, among some constituencies. With a global trend toward urbanization, cities are becoming a growing site for inequalities. They find high levels of wealth and modern infrastructure coexist with pockets of severe deprivation, often side by side. This makes gaping and increasing levels of inequality all the more glaring within cities.
The only way that we can live is if we grow. The only way that we can grow is if we change. The only way that we can change is if we learn. The only way we can learn is if we are exposed, and the only way that we can become exposed is if we throw ourselves out into the open. Do it. Thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoy my radio man. See you next time.